The creek was a liar. In the dry months, it whispered promises of coolness and life, a silver thread stitching their hard scrabble patch of land together. But Cora knew its heart. When the sky turned the color of a bad bruise, the creek would swell and rage, a brown monster that clawed at its banks, hungry to take back the little they had. Her husband Jacob had called it the Giving and Taking Creek. It had given them this land, the only parcel they could claim. A year ago, it had taken Jacob, a sudden fever stealing the breath from him as fast as a flash flood. Now it was just Cora and the boys, 4 of them, Jacob's legacy and her whole world. Samuel, the oldest at 14, had his father's shoulders and quiet sense of duty. He moved with a slow, deliberate weight, as if he understood the world was a heavy thing to carry. Then came Matthew, 12, the watcher, with eyes that missed nothing and a skill for gentling the half-wild chickens they kept. The twins, Luke and Mark, were 8, a matched set of dusty knees and tangled brown hair, all sharp elbows and sudden surprising questions. They were good boys. They were her boys. But feeding 4 of them was a constant battle against an empty larder and unforgiving soil. This afternoon, the air had gone heavy and still, the birds silent. A storm was coming. Cora stood on the porch of their one-room cabin, a structure of mud and chinked logs that leaned as if tired of its own existence. She watched Samuel and Matthew securing the rope that tethered their milk cow, ensuring she couldn't bolt. The twins were gathering the last of the kindling under the porch, their small hands working with a practiced efficiency that made her heart ache. They had been children for such a short time. "Get inside now," she called, her voice not loud but carrying over the rising wind. "It's going to break any minute." They obeyed without argument, tumbling through the door, bringing the smell of dust and ozone in with them. Cora followed, barring the door against the coming onslaught. The cabin immediately felt smaller, crowded with the restless energy of 4 boys and the weight of the storm pressing in. The first drops of rain hit the sod roof with the sound of scattered pebbles. Then more, and more, until it was a relentless drumming, a sound that rattled her teeth. The lyre in the hollow was beginning to sing its angry song. It was Matthew, the watcher, who saw it first. He was pressed against the single glass-paned window, a luxury salvaged from a burned-out wagon, his breath fogging the pain. "Mama," he said, his voice tight, "there's something in the water." Cora moved to his side, wiping the glass with her sleeve. The creek was no longer a creek. It was a churning, muddy river, twice its normal width, spitting foam and carrying whole branches downstream. For a moment she saw nothing but the chaos. Then she saw what Matthew had seen: a horse, struggling against the current, its eyes wide with terror, and a man, clinging to its saddle, his head low, barely above the roiling surface. The horse lost its footing, went under, then surfaced again, screaming, a sound of pure panic that was swallowed by the roar of the water. The man was swept from the saddle, a dark shape tumbling in the brown flood. "Samuel, the rope," Cora said, her voice cutting through the noise of the storm. There was no hesitation, no debate. It was a person. That was all that mattered. Samuel was already moving, grabbing the thick coil of rope they used for everything from hauling logs to pulling the cow from the mud. He met her at the door, his young face set in grim lines that made him look too much like his father. "It's bad, Mama." "I know," she said, pulling her worn shawl tighter. "Luke, Mark, stay away from the door. Matthew, you watch from the window. Yell if you see him go under for good." She and Samuel stepped out into the maelstrom. The rain was a solid sheet of water, cold and blinding. The ground was already slick mud, trying to suck the boots from her feet. They scrambled toward the edge of the bank, the roar of the creek filling their ears. The man was still visible, snagged for a moment on a half-submerged log. He wasn't fighting anymore, just a limp form at the mercy of the current. "He's letting go," Matthew shouted from the cabin. "No time to tie it!" Cora yelled to Samuel over the din. "You hold this end. Dig your heels in. Don't you let go. You hear me? Don't you dare." She wrapped the other end of the rope twice around her waist, knotting it with hands that were numb but sure. She didn't give her son a chance to argue, to be afraid for her. She began wading into the water. The cold was a shock that stole her breath. The current was a physical blow, a great dark hand pushing her, trying to sweep her feet from under her. The water was at her knees, then her hips. It was full of debris, things that scraped and bumped against her legs. She kept her eyes on the man, a few yards downstream. The log that had caught him was shifting, groaning. She had one chance. She pushed forward, leaning into the force of the water, feeling the rope go taut behind her. Samuel was holding. Her boy was holding. The thought gave her a surge of strength. She reached the man just as the log broke free and tumbled away. She grabbed a fistful of his sodden coat, the fabric slick and heavy. He was dead weight, his face pale and slack, a bloody gash on his forehead. For a terrifying second she thought she was too late. Then he coughed, a weak rattling sound, and a gout of muddy water spilled from his lips. "I've got him!" she screamed, though she wasn't sure if Samuel could hear. "Pull! Samuel, pull!" The rope bit into her waist. She turned, shielding the man's head with her body, and began the agonizing fight back to the bank. It was like trying to walk through molasses while a giant tried to drag her under. Every step was a victory. She could feel Samuel straining, digging his heels into the mud. She saw Matthew appear at the edge of the bank, then the twins, their small faces pale with fear but their hands reaching out. They formed a chain, her sons, a link of love and desperation against the storm. Matthew grabbed Samuel's belt. Luke grabbed Matthew's. Mark grabbed Luke's, a tiny anchor at the end of the line. With one last desperate heave, her feet found purchase on the slippery bank. They scrambled, slipped, and fell. But they fell forward, onto the solid, muddy ground, dragging the unconscious man with them. They lay there for a moment, gasping in the pouring rain, a heap of soaked wool and trembling limbs, the dead weight of the stranger a heavy presence between them. They had done it. Her boys. They had pulled a man from the jaws of the lying creek. Getting him to the cabin was a different kind of battle. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder and long of limb, and carrying him was like trying to haul a felled tree. Samuel took his shoulders, Cora his legs, and Matthew and the twins pushed from behind. They slipped and slid in the mud, their breath coming in ragged bursts, the rain plastering their hair to their faces. By the time they wrestled him through the door and onto the packed earth floor, they were all shaking with cold and exertion. Cora barred the door again, shutting out the storm's fury. The sudden quiet of the cabin was broken only by their harsh breathing and the dripping of water from their clothes. The man lay still, a puddle forming around him. His face was ashen under a dark stubble, his clothes fine but ruined. A stranger. A drowned stranger on her floor. "Luke, fetch the extra blankets from the chest," she ordered, her voice regaining its command. "Mark, put more wood on the fire. Samuel, help me get these wet things off him before he freezes." There was no room for modesty in survival. With Samuel's help, she stripped the man of his heavy, waterlogged coat and shirt. The flesh beneath was cold to the touch. His chest was a wall of muscle, corded and strong, but it rose and fell with a shallow, rattling breath. She saw old scars, faint white lines against his skin, but her focus was on the gash on his temple, still oozing blood. "Matthew, bring me the clean rags and the witch hazel," she said. Working with a grim efficiency born of long practice, she cleaned the wound. She pressed her ear to his chest, listening to the water still gurgling in his lungs. This was the dangerous part. She rolled him onto his side, then with a strength she didn't know she possessed, she balled her fist and struck him hard between the shoulder blades. Once, twice. He convulsed, and a torrent of creek water and bile rushed from his mouth. He choked, gasped, and then his breathing deepened, still ragged but clearer. They rolled him onto his back again, and Cora covered him with the dry, scratchy wool blankets. She sat back on her heels, her whole body aching. The boys were gathered around, their eyes wide. They had seen death. They had seen their father waste away. But they had never seen a life so nearly lost brought back from the brink. "Is he going to live, Mama?" Mark asked, his small voice barely a whisper. Cora looked at the stranger's face. There were lines of hardship around his eyes, a grim set to his mouth even in unconsciousness. He was not a soft man, but he was breathing. His heart was beating. "We did what we could," she said, pulling a wet strand of hair from her own face. "The rest is up to him and the Lord." For 2 days, the man drifted in a fevered haze. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a creek that had returned to its murmuring, lying self. Cora barely slept. She spooned broth into him when he was conscious enough to swallow, bathed his face with cool water, and changed the dressing on his head. The boys moved with a hushed reverence around the cabin, tiptoeing past the sleeping form that took up so much of their small space. On the 3rd morning, she was stirring their meager pot of oatmeal when a voice, low and rough with disuse, spoke from the corner. "Where am I?" Cora turned. The man was awake. His eyes were open, a startlingly clear gray, and they were fixed on her. They held a deep, weary intelligence, and a confusion that seemed to irritate him. He tried to sit up but groaned and fell back against the pallet. "You're in my cabin," Cora said, walking over to him. She felt the boys gather behind her, a small protective wall. "You were in the creek. My sons and I, we pulled you out." His gaze shifted, taking in the 4 young faces staring down at him. He looked at the rough-hewn walls, the single window, the stone hearth. His eyes lingered on the patched clothes of her sons, the worn-out soles of their shoes. He seemed to be piecing together a world far from his own. "The creek," he repeated, his voice raspy. He closed his eyes, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "My horse?" "I'm sorry," Cora said softly. "We haven't seen it." He was silent for a long moment. He opened his eyes again and looked directly at her. There was no pity in his gaze, but a clear, sharp assessment. He was taking her measure. "I owe you my life," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a debt acknowledged. "You owe my sons," she corrected gently. "They saw you. They held the rope." His gray eyes moved over the boys again, one by one. "What are your names?" he asked. Samuel, as the oldest, answered for them, his voice steady. "I'm Samuel. This is Matthew, and that's Luke and Mark." The man nodded slowly, as if memorizing the names. "My name is Larkin," he said. "Larkin Webb." The name meant nothing to Cora or the boys, but when she went into the small settlement of Providence for supplies a few days later, it meant everything to everyone else. Larkin was well enough to sit up and eat solid food, but still too weak to travel. He had pressed a coin into her hand, a silver dollar that felt heavier than its weight, and insisted she buy flour and salt pork. "And something for the boys," he'd added, his voice firm. At the general store, Mr. Henderson's eyes went wide when she mentioned the name of the man recovering in her cabin. "Larkin Webb, of the Broken T Ranch? Good Lord, woman, the whole valley's been looking for him. They thought he was dead." Cora learned that Larkin Webb owned nearly everything from the river to the mountains. He was the most powerful man in the territory, a cattle baron whose word was law. He was also a man shadowed by tragedy. Years ago, the creek, their creek, had flooded in the night and taken his wife and infant son. He had rebuilt his ranch, grown his herds, but the townfolk said he had never rebuilt himself. He was a hard man, respected but not loved, a man who kept the world at arm's length. And he was living on a corn shuck mattress on the floor of her cabin. When she returned, she looked at him differently. She saw not just a survivor, but a man of immense power and immense pain, brought low by the same water that had shaped his life. He seemed to sense the change in her. "You went to town," he stated, watching her unpack the supplies. "I did. And now you know who I am." "I know what people say you are," she answered, arranging the sacks of flour on the shelf. She turned to face him, her hands dusted white. "It doesn't change the fact that you were a drowning man and my boys pulled you out." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps respect, showed in his eyes. He gave a slight nod, accepting her terms. The debt remained personal, not financial. In the weeks that followed, an unusual rhythm established itself in the small cabin. Larkin healed. His strength returned slowly, but with it came a quiet, observant presence that changed the dynamic of their home. He never spoke of his ranch or his wealth. Instead, he watched. He watched Cora knead bread, her arms strong and sure. He watched her mend the boys' clothes by the light of a single tallow candle, her face patient in the flickering glow. He watched her deal out discipline and comfort in equal measure. He began to interact with the boys. He saw Samuel struggling with their dull, chipped axe. The next morning, a brand new axe with a sharp, gleaming head was leaning against the woodpile. Larkin never said a word about it. He just nodded to Samuel and said, "A good swing comes from the legs, not the back." He spent the afternoon teaching him, the steady thud of the axe a new sound in their clearing. He noticed Matthew's fascination with a broken trap. He sat with the quiet boy for hours, using his own pocket knife to whittle a new trigger mechanism, explaining the simple physics of it in a low, patient voice. Matthew, who rarely spoke more than 2 words at a time, began to follow him around like a shadow. One evening, he saw the twins trying to carve figures out of scraps of wood with dull stones. The next day, he presented them each with a small, sharp whittling knife. "Careful now," he warned, his voice gruff. "A sharp knife is safer than a dull one, but it demands respect." He showed them how to hold it, how to shave the wood away from their bodies, and soon the porch was littered with the beginnings of misshapen animals and lopsided soldiers. Cora watched it all with a wary heart. Her boys were starved for a man's attention, for the kind of quiet guidance their father was no longer there to give. Larkin was filling a space that had been achingly empty. But he was a temporary fixture, a bird with a mended wing. Soon he would fly back to his own world, and the hole he left behind would feel even bigger than before. The slow burn of their connection happened in the silences. It was in the way he started leaving a cup of coffee for her by the hearth in the morning, just the way she liked it. It was in the way she saved him a plate of food when he worked late with Samuel, reinforcing a loose fence post or rehanging the cabin door so it no longer sagged. They worked side by side, weeding her pathetic vegetable garden, and the shared, comfortable silence said more than an hour of conversation ever could. One evening, the chill of autumn was sharp in the air. The boys were asleep, 4 still lumps under their blankets. Cora sat by the fire, darning a sock, while Larkin oiled a piece of leather tack he was braiding. The firelight danced on his face, deepening the lines around his eyes. He had been quiet all day, his gaze often drifting towards the window, towards the sound of the creek. "This creek," he said suddenly, his voice low. "It took my wife, my boy." Cora's hands stilled in her lap. She had heard the story in town, but hearing it from him, in the quiet of her cabin, was different. The words were heavy, each one a stone he had carried for years. "Her name was Eleanor," he went on, his eyes fixed on the flames. "And the boy, we called him Thomas." He said the names as if they were foreign, rusted from disuse. "It was a spring flood, came up in the night. Our first cabin was too close to the water. A lot like this one." He paused, and the silence was thick with what he wasn't saying. "I was away, buying cattle. When I got back, there was nothing left. Just mud and splintered wood." Cora's heart constricted. She didn't offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. The grief was too old, too vast for that. Instead, she simply sat with him in the shared darkness, her presence a quiet testament to her understanding of loss. She knew what it was to look at a future that had been wiped clean, to stand in the wreckage of a life and wonder how to take the next breath. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes raw with a pain he had clearly never shown another living soul. "You and your sons, pulling me out of that same water." He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. In that moment, Cora understood. She hadn't just saved his life. She and her sons, a living, breathing family, had pulled him from the sight of his own drowning grief. They had rescued him in more ways than one. She reached out, her hand covering his for just a second. His skin was calloused and warm. It was a simple gesture, an anchor in a sea of memory. He turned his hand over, his fingers brushing against hers, a touch so light it was barely there, but it sent a shock straight through her. Neither of them breathed. Then he pulled his hand away, stood up, and went to his pallet, turning his back to the fire. The moment was over, but something had irrevocably shifted between them. A few days later, a wagon from the Broken Tea Ranch arrived. A foreman, a man with a weathered face and respectful eyes, stood on her porch, hat in hand. "Mr. Webb, sir, we were worried sick." Larkin's time in their world was over. He stood beside the foreman, looking taller, more imposing now that the context of his real life had arrived. He looked at Cora, and for a moment, he was just the man she had nursed back to health, the man who had taught her sons to whittle. "I'll be sending supplies," he said. It was a statement, not an offer. "Anything you need?" "We don't need charity, Mr. Webb," Cora said, her pride a shield. "It's not charity," he said, his voice dropping low so only she could hear. "It's a debt. One I can never fully repay. Let me do this, Cora." It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded different in his mouth, solid and real. She gave a single reluctant nod. He turned to the boys who stood in a solemn line. He shook Samuel's hand, man to man. He laid a hand on Matthew's shoulder. He crouched down to look the twins in the eye. "You be good for your mother," he said. "You're good boys, the best I've ever known." Then he climbed into the wagon and rode away, leaving behind a silence in the cabin that was bigger than the space he had occupied. True to his word, the supplies arrived weekly. Not just flour and beans, but slabs of bacon, bolts of cloth, new boots for the boys, things Cora hadn't even allowed herself to dream of. But with the supplies came attention. The people of Providence, who had mostly ignored the struggling widow by the creek, now watched her with a mixture of suspicion and envy. The whispers started in the general store, then spread to the church steps. They said she had trapped him, a helpless grieving man. They said she was using her sons to play on his sympathies. The architect of this campaign of whispers was Mrs. Gable, the town's self-appointed matriarch. She was a woman whose wealth was matched only by her rigid sense of social order. She had a daughter, a pale, listless girl named Priscilla, whom she had long intended for Larkin Webb. The union would have consolidated the two largest properties in the valley. Cora and her 4 dusty boys were an unwelcome complication. One afternoon, Mrs. Gable's polished black buggy appeared in their clearing. She descended like a queen visiting the slums, her silk dress rustling, her face a mask of false sympathy. My dear Mrs. Miller," she began, her eyes sweeping over the humble cabin with disdain. "I've come out of concern, for you and for poor Mr. Webb." Cora stood on her porch, wiping her hands on her apron, refusing to be intimidated. "I am fine, Mrs. Gable, and Mr. Webb seemed well enough when he left." "Oh, physically, I'm sure," the woman purred, tapping a gloved finger against her lips. "But a man in his position, suffering from such a profound loss, he is vulnerable. It would be a terrible thing if someone were to take advantage of his gratitude." The implication was as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass. "No one is taking advantage of anyone," Cora said, her voice cold. "My sons and I helped a man in need. He is a decent person who wishes to show his thanks. That is all." "Is it?" Mrs. Gable smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "Be careful, my dear. Men like Larkin Webb do not marry women like you. They do not bring 4 rough boys into a house like his. You are setting yourself, and those poor children, up for a great fall." The woman's visit was a declaration of war. The town grew colder. Women who had once given Cora a polite nod now turned away. Men who had offered a tip of the hat now stared right through her. Her sons felt it too. At the settlement school, they were shunned, their patched clothes and their mother's supposed ambition making them targets. Larkin rode out to see them twice. The visits were strained, the easy companionship of the cabin replaced by an unspoken tension. He saw the new fence post Samuel had set, the neat stacks of firewood, the way the boys were wearing their new boots. But he also saw the worry in Cora's eyes, the way she held herself stiffly, as if expecting a blow. He knew something was wrong, but he was a man who dealt in cattle and land, not in the subtle poison of gossip. He didn't know how to ask, and she was too proud to tell him. The crisis came on Founder's Day. It was the biggest social event of the year, a town picnic held in the meadow behind the church. Cora usually avoided it, but the boys had begged to go, eager for the 3-legged races and the promise of cake. Bolstered by Larkin's support, feeling a fragile sense of security, she had agreed. It was a mistake. They were a conspicuous island in the sea of townsfolk. People stared, whispered behind their hands. Cora tried to ignore it, spreading their blanket near the edge of the meadow and focusing on her sons. Larkin was there, acting as one of the judges for the horse races, and when he saw them, he walked over, his presence creating a ripple of silence around them. He greeted the boys warmly and gave Cora a nod that was both a greeting and a promise of support. It was this public acknowledgement that sealed their fate. Mrs. Gable could not abide it. She waited until Larkin was called away, then she made her move. She passed by their blanket, surrounded by her circle of gossiping women, and spoke in a voice that was meant to carry. "It is a shame," she said, looking directly at Cora, "when widows of a certain character forget their station. Using their own children as bait to hook a man of property. It's hardly decent." The words struck Cora like a physical slap. The blood drained from her face. Before she could even react, Samuel was on his feet. "You take that back," he said, his voice trembling with a 14-year-old's outrage. "My mother is not like that." Mrs. Gable's son, a pampered lout of 16, stepped forward. "Your mother's a beggar and a whore," he sneered. Samuel launched himself at the boy. It was a flurry of fists and fury. The picnic erupted into chaos. Men rushed to pull the boys apart. Cora grabbed Samuel, his face bloody, his eyes blazing with a righteous anger that broke her heart. She saw the faces around her, some shocked, most smug and satisfied. They had gotten the show they had come for. Her humiliation was complete. Without a word, she gathered her sons, her hands shaking, her face a mask of stone. She walked away from the picnic, from the stares and the whispers, her dignity in tatters. That night, in the quiet of the cabin, she made a decision. She couldn't stay. She couldn't raise her sons in a place that would twist their father's memory and their mother's name into something ugly. She couldn't let them grow up fighting for her honor. And she couldn't be the scandal that clung to Larkin Webb. a decent man who was only trying to repay a debt. She began to pack. It didn't take long. They had so little. She folded their few spare clothes into a worn carpet bag. She wrapped the tin plates and the wooden spoons in a cloth. She looked around the cabin that had been their only home, the place where she had loved her husband and birthed her babies. It was a poor place, but it had been theirs. Now, even it felt tainted. The boys watched her, their faces somber. They didn't ask why. They knew. They had seen the ugliness in the meadow. A horse thundered into the clearing, the sound of its hooves frantic. Cora's heart leaped into her throat. It was Larkin. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had even stopped, his face a thundercloud. He must have heard. He must have come to tell her to go, to sever the ties that were causing him so much trouble. He strode to the cabin, his eyes taking in the pathetic pile of their packed belongings by the door. His expression softened from anger to something else, something that looked like pain. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice quiet. "We're leaving, Mr. Webb," Cora said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It's for the best." "The best for who?" he demanded. "For them? For that venomous old woman and her pack of gossips?" "For my sons," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "I won't have them growing up in a town that spits on their mother's name. And for you, you've done more than enough. Your debt is paid. You don't need this trouble." He stepped closer into the small space of the cabin, filling it with his presence. He looked at the boys, at their packed belongings, at her face, pale and determined in the lamplight. He seemed to understand that arguing would be useless. Her pride was a fortress. "Don't go," he said, his voice dropping to a plea. "Not like this. Give me one more day, just until morning. Let me show you something." She looked at him, suspicion warring with a desperate sliver of hope. "Show me what?" "Trust me, Cora," he said. "You trusted me enough to pull me from that creek. Trust me one more time." She searched his eyes and saw no pity, only a fierce, unwavering resolve. She looked at her sons, at their tired, confused faces. One more day. What could it hurt? She gave a slow, weary nod. Until morning. The next morning, he arrived not with a single horse but with a sturdy wagon. He didn't say a word about the events of the picnic or her plans to leave. He simply said, "Come with me, all of you." Wary but intrigued, Cora and her sons climbed into the wagon. He didn't drive toward the town or toward his own grand ranch house. Instead, he turned onto an old logging track that led up the side of the valley, away from the creek, climbing toward a high meadow she had only ever seen from a distance. The air grew cooler as they climbed, the scent of pine replacing the damp smell of the lowlands. They broke through the trees into a wide, sun-drenched meadow. The view was breathtaking. The entire valley spread out below them, the Liar Creek just a harmless silver ribbon in the distance. The land was high and dry, dotted with ancient oaks and flat, grassy expanses. It was beautiful. It was safe. And it was not empty. Several wagons were already there, laden with fresh-cut lumber, shingles, and crates of nails. A half-dozen men, hands from the broken T, stood waiting, their hammers and saws at their sides. They greeted Larkin with respectful nods. Larkin helped Cora down from the wagon. He led her and the boys to the center of the meadow, where stakes and string marked out the foundation of a building. It was not a small foundation. He stopped and turned to her, his face serious. He unrolled a set of drawings he pulled from his saddlebag. It was a plan, a design for a house. It had a wide front porch, a large kitchen, and 4 small rooms branching off a central living space. 4 rooms. One for her, and one for each of her sons to have his own bed. Cora stared at the drawing, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. She looked from the paper to the waiting wagons, to the faces of the men, and finally to Larkin. He met her gaze, his gray eyes clear and steady. He spoke, his voice loud enough for his men and her sons to hear every word. "You and your boys, you didn't just save my life," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "You did more than that. You reminded me what a home is. It isn't four walls. It's the people inside them. It's noise and arguments and the smell of bread baking. It's looking out for one another. You gave that back to me." He gestured to the staked-out ground. "This is not a payment. A life can't be bought. This is not charity. This is a beginning. A safe place, high above the water that's taken too much from both of us." He took a step closer, his voice dropping so it was for her alone. "Mrs. Gable was right about one thing," he said softly. "A man like me can't bring a woman like you and 4 boys into that empty house of mine. It's full of ghosts. It's not a home. It's a tomb. We need to build a new one. Together." Tears welled in Cora's eyes, blurring the drawing, the meadow, the face of the man standing before her. She saw her sons staring, their mouths agape, their eyes filled with a wonder she hadn't seen in years. This was his answer to the whispers, to the shame, to the cruelty of the town. Not a defense, not an argument, an action. A permanent, undeniable, stunning declaration built of timber and nails. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "If you'll have it," he said, "if you'll have me." Cora looked at her sons. Samuel's face was filled with a fierce, protective pride. Matthew was smiling, a rare, brilliant thing. The twins were vibrating with an excitement they couldn't contain. She looked at the high, safe ground, at the promise of a future free from fear and whispers. Then she looked at Larkin, this powerful, broken man who had seen her, truly seen her, not as a poor widow, but as a woman strong enough to save him. She had pulled him from the water. He was pulling her from the mud. It was the most mutual rescue of all. "Yes," she whispered, the word a release of all the pain and struggle she had carried for so long. "Yes, we'll have it." Months later, the house stood as if it had always been there, a solid, welcoming presence on the high meadow. It was made of sturdy pine, with a wide porch that caught the morning sun, and a stone chimney that breathed a steady plume of wood smoke into the crisp autumn air. From the porch, you could see the whole valley, a world that had once seemed so hostile now laid out like a map at their feet. The town of Providence was a distant collection of rooftops, its whispers unable to reach this high. Cora stood on that porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands, and watched her sons. They were thriving. Samuel worked alongside Larkin and his men, learning the rhythms of the ranch, his shoulders broadening with purpose. Matthew had discovered a gift for horses, his quiet patience making him a natural at the stables. The twins had a whole meadow for their adventures, their laughter the constant soundtrack of this new life. They were boys again. The front door creaked open and Larkin came to stand beside her. He had changed too. The grim, solitary shell he had inhabited for so long had cracked open. The lines of grief around his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He no longer looked like a man haunted by the ghosts of his past, but a man building a future with the living. He didn't speak, just slipped his hand over hers, his fingers lacing through her own. It was a simple, comfortable gesture, as much a part of their daily routine as the rising sun. They stood in silence, watching the boys chase a stray calf in the distance. The house behind them was warm and filled with the smell of baking bread. It was more than a structure. It was a sanctuary. It was the stunning answer to a debt of life, a monument to a second chance. He had built them a house, but together, they had built a home. The frontier was still wild, the winters still long, but here, on this high ground, held in the circle of this unexpected family, Cora was finally safe. She was finally home.